Hello, intermediate art students. So like I was talking about in the previous video, the first thing that I'm going to be working on when I start adding color to this particular project is my background. So that basically just means any of the wider, sort of more open spaces and shapes. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to start to pick a spot and I'm going to get it wet. I'm not going to worry too much about the footprints here. Now I am going to keep the ant dry because I don't want my background to go into the ant. But in terms of my footprints, I know that I'm eventually just going to be making them silhouettes of black. So I'm not too concerned about going over them. So I'm just going to get it good and wet. And this is a really good technique for any time that you are working on a larger area and you want it to be one color or similar colors or really smooth looking. You can just put water down first and it will help that pigment spread more, which will of course help you work less and make the color do a little bit more of what you want it to do. Because again, when you are working with watercolors, learning how to work with the medium and let the medium do what it naturally does is very, very important. So now let's say I want to just put some sort of a periwinkle purple into that area. So remember, you do want to have some type of an idea of what type of color scheme you want to use. If you want to use mostly warm colors, cool colors, kind of a random placement of colors, whatever you want to do there. In this particular instance, because I'm mostly concerned with reminding you all of some techniques you can use, I'm not going to worry too much about my color scheme yet. So remember, this one is the wet on wet, where the pigment and the colors will all just kind of mix and merge. I'm just dropping little bits of color in there, adding water as needed, and letting those colors really mix and kind of do their own thing. Maybe add a little bit of pink in that area. The main thing to keep in mind when you're working with the wet and wet is to make sure that the colors that you are putting side by side will actually mix together and not just make a brown sort of muddy color. So I'm just going to keep some of these cooler colors in this particular area. So right now what I'm working on is some of this negative space, and I do want to make sure that it is completely covered and smooth and solid. So essentially, as I work, I'm just periodically going to go right up to the edges of the shapes that are next to that negative space and just make sure that they're not irregular. Make sure that the pigment actually goes all the way to that space, to that edge. So remember, this does leave your paper quite wet, so you can't do a whole lot other than just let it dry once you get this type of technique started. So I'm just going to kind of let these move around. Now remember, I can also actually move my page to further the kind of motion and movement of those colors. If it goes off the paper, that's okay. Because the color will primarily only go where I have water. Now, if you have something like this happen, where it goes beyond where you have water, you can just dry it up with a paper towel, which I'm going to go grab. And now, because it is a very light area, I'm not too concerned about what had just happened there. I'm pretty sure that whatever color I use on top of that will be solid enough to cause that not to remain a problem. I'm just going to lift some of that up. Remember, at this point, I can even sponge all of this up to kind of create a texture if I wanted. Something like that, and let it dry. I could go back over it with more things later. I could leave it like that. For now, I'm just going to leave that one as is and move to another area and remind you guys of another technique. So let's see here. Perhaps I want to bring some of that pink down into this corner here where I've got my footprints. I'll just move my paper up so you guys can see a little better of what I'm doing. Down here where I've got the footprints. And this time I'm just going to go directly in with my very saturated, very heavy-bodied pink. Still making sure that I focus on where I want my shapes to be and where I want that color to be, and avoiding the areas where I don't. Putting lots of pigment down. Remembering that watercolor does dry quickly, so I want to keep it pretty wet because I'm actually going to use the salt technique here, which, remember, just kind of creates a bit of a speckly effect. So I'm just going to get lots of pigment on there. I can use multiple colors for this. I can use one color. I could go in with some red mixed in here to bring some extra warmth to that pink. I could go in with some yellow. Or I could go with some more of that blue or the teal color or the purple that I've already used. So like I said, I'm not worried as much about my color scheme on this particular piece because I'm using it more as a reminder of some different techniques that you can use. But you do want to consider the colors that you use. Think about how they work together. Do not just arbitrarily and randomly use color. You guys know more about color than that. So I expect to see that you know more about color than that. So here I think I'm going to put a little bit of that tealish color here. Kind of let those blend together. So you can see that right now you can't see those footprints anymore simply because I put such a saturated teal here. But as I continue to work in this space, the saturation will kind of diminish. The water will cause that color to be a little more transparent, and I'll be able to see those footprints again. So I am not too concerned about them being temporarily covered up. So I'm going to bring a little more of that teal along this bottom edge and just kind of let those two colors blend a little more for some variety. And because for this next step, I'm going to want a lot of pigment on my paper. So now I'm quite literally just going to put some salt in my hand and sprinkle the salt onto the paper. You can already see the effect starting to take place, but you will not see the full effect until the paint is dry and you are able to scrape that salt off. So the next thing I would do would be to carefully move my paper a little bit. Remember, I can't do anything in either of those areas until things are a bit more dry. And then the last technique that I'm going to remind you of, I'll just put into this background space. Because once again, I am focusing on my background before I work into the foreground or the positive space. You always want to work from the back toward the front.